Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and finance side of the space startup ecosystem. My name is Matt Gjertsen of Better Everyday Studios, and I am joined today by Brian Mejeur of AdAstra Talent Advisors. How are you doing today, Brian?
Fantastic. Excited to be here.
Awesome. And I am also joined with Justus Kilian from Space Capital. How are you doing, Justus?
Great. Excited to chat.
Yeah, I'm really excited because you got some feedback from a few listeners. And so these next 3 episodes are going to be a little bit different in the sense that very often what happens is whoever the host of the day is kind of comes with a question that we pose to the other members of the panel and then we discuss. But based on some feedback that you received, there was some question of just like, well, this is great that you're kind of covering all these different questions, but what are some just like basic initial processes? What are the best practices for companies in each of your 3 areas of discipline? So that's what we're going to be doing for these next 3 episodes. So we're going to start with me talking about leadership development. And so what I hope to do with you all today is I'm going to walk you through kind of what I think are the first 3 steps that any company should take regarding developing leaders within their organization, developing managers. And they're basically arranged kind of in level of lift, because I'm thinking smaller companies, as they're growing, resources are always constrained. And so I have 3 kind of basic steps that I want to walk each of you through, and then I'll kind of pause as we go, and you can ask me any questions on that. And so the first most important step that I think any organization needs to take, that surprisingly a lot of them don't, is defining what leadership is within the organization. Because I think there's, what a leader is, what a manager is expected to do can be very different depending on the organization. And so the kind of the best practice that I've seen worked really well for this, and this can start as early as, it could start from the very beginning, when you're setting company culture, or maybe you ideally do it, before you pass a dozen or so people, but you get kind of the principal stakeholders, whether that's the executive team or whoever that might be, in a room together. And you just kind of go around the room, ask the question of who are the best managers in the organization, and then ask the question, why are they the best managers in the organization? And when you do that, you kind of get a list of behaviors that you're seeing of what you expect managers to be doing. And I think that's kind of the first lay of the land of define what management means in your organization. Any questions on that, or how does that sound to you all?
I mean, it sounds amazing. I think in practice, sometimes it could be harder. I wonder when, you have a CEO with a big personality, what aspect does that play in sort of defining leadership? And, there's a variety of different leadership styles coming from CEOs. Like, what happens if that translates down to management? Like, they're emulating behavior. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Oftentimes I see that like indirect definition of managerial style getting sort of perpetuated. So
I definitely think I've seen that as well. And you bring up a great point. Though I said you should do this very early on, clearly, as a company grows, you're going to have to change that definition a little bit, probably. And so as you reach different stages, the companies that I've seen do this the best are companies that, when they're around 100 or so and they're hiring kind of their first HR person, they hire a very strong and experienced HR person who, if the founder has a little bit of, a stronger personality, they at least can match each other and can have honest conversations with one another, so that you can kind of call those things out. But I think, to your point, exactly what goes wrong is if you don't define it and you just let everything happen because that's what people see. That's when you create a lot of these situations where, people are following bad practices, not because anybody thinks they're good, but because that's what the founder does. So that's what the CEO does, or whatever. And so I obviously this definition does take a lot of emotional intelligence probably among that executive team of being willing to call out maybe behaviors that they know are theirs, but that they kind of wish weren't theirs, or that they don't think everybody should do. That takes a lot for sure.
This is great, Matt. And then do you find that often like you define these behaviors and then you extract like certain personality types that tend to be common, or are there, maybe it's more like archetypes of which kind of leaders are most successful in the organization, right? There's, the leader who leads by doing, the level 5, like humble leader, or maybe, like whatever it might be. There's all these different archetypes. So like, what do you tend to see kind of simplify or rise to the top through that discussion?
I honestly think it just kind of stops with behaviors to me. I mean, I agree with you. You can bubble those up to things like archetypes or personality types or things like that. But I like to leave as much room as possible for people to, there's plenty of people who come to work one way when they are themselves kind of different. They recognize that because of the nature of the organization, we need people who are pretty outgoing and really able to step in front and take charge of a room, but they themselves are personally extremely introverted and they don't want to do that. As long as they're able to exhibit that behavior in the workplace, I don't care. And so I think that's why I tend to stop at behaviors, though I agree you can level it up, but then it just takes another level of discussion. I think that can be kind of tricky also to level it up in that way.
Makes sense.
So that's the first step. And I think I like that because though it can be kind of emotionally challenging, like there's not a ton of resources that are required for something like that. The second thing that I think is really important to do is to create a manager community within the organization. And this can come in a lot of different forms, but I'll give you one example of something called Mastermind Sessions. I've done this exercise a few times at different conferences, and it was always really great. And so really all you do is you say, you bring all your managers together, you break them up into teams of 5, tables of 5, and all you're doing is for 10 minutes, one person explains a problem that they have to the table, and then the table tries to help them solve that problem. And then after 10 minutes, you go to the next person. After 10 minutes, you go to the next person, right? And so you can do 5 or 6, but usually you want to do tables of 5. So then you can do the full 10 minutes and you have a little bit of a break in between. These end up being amazing discussions, lots of insight. Everybody always leaves like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You do that once a month. All you have to do is have somebody who's able to wrangle those people together, and you have to have a culture that's willing to take managers out of the work they're doing for an hour. But it's still a relatively low lift effort. It can help people solve actual real problems, generate connections amongst those managers that might not have been there before. Because I think all the better you can set people up at tables where they don't normally work with the people that they're sitting with. And it just signifies that being a manager is a different thing. Like there's this new community that you are now a part of. And so that to me is one of the most valuable interventions you can do in terms of like the ROI for the amount of lift that it takes.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I think I see a similar process in the medical field where it can be quite common, given a patient or a situation, to huddle with sort of the care team and to align around the key priorities and what's happening and get multiple perspectives on a set of problems. So everybody's aligned and you can bring in, each person's unique experience to try to help identify problems or solutions that might not be obvious. And I think that's become pretty standard practice in the medical profession. So it could make sense on the management side. I really like that.
Yeah, I think, I like the idea of pre-briefs and debriefs and kind of, bringing that whole team together, I think is a really common thing. This is just like kind of the most simplified version of it, in that the only commonality between them is that you're all managers in the organization and you're not coming in with any sense of a particular problem you're trying to solve, but it still gives you that opportunity to form all those same connections and generate all those same ideas.
That's really neat, Matt. I'm curious if there's any possible dynamics that can come up when you have these like separate groups that like leaders are a part of and then like individual contributors are not. And it's like a pretty natural thing for individual contributors to feel like they're not on the same like path, or that's like not as good to be an individual contributor as a leader. Is there a way to like protect against that while still like acknowledging the fact that the jobs are different? Right?
Yeah, totally. I 100% can see that being a problem, especially, and I think a lot of companies, there's still plenty of companies out there that do like high potential tracks and stuff like that, which I think definitely cause those rifts. And certainly if your other talent practices, right, like aren't very good, if you don't have transparent ways in which you promote people, or and the reasons for that aren't very good, or how you hire people and why you fire people aren't good, that I think that's going to tend to be, if people are really feeling left out of the group, then I think one, it's probably a problem with some other problem within your talent ecosystem. But then the other thing would be, hopefully you have similar programs for other people as well. So it's not like this is the only thing you do. And I think that could, you could easily imagine doing this same thing, but just from a slightly different angle, of rather than it being specific kind of like to manager problems, it's to engineering problems, or it's to, or it's just to problems that you're having at work. And so I think as long as you give other opportunities, you can prevent that from happening. And so those first two things, or go for it, Justus.
Just a few tactical questions on that. So what stage of a company or how many employees would you typically start to implement this?
Since we're talking about managers, I think a lot of it depends on how many managers you have, right? I mean, if you only have 5 people leaders in your organization, then you're probably meeting quite frequently already. But once you get to, I think a lot of things really, really start mattering when the initial founding team aren't making all the hiring decisions anymore, right? Once you almost have like that third layer, that's probably when you start to get into the several dozen employees to 100 employees. You have 100 employees, you got a dozen people managers, like that kind of level is probably when this starts to become really, really important.
And does the C-suite participate in this in any way?
I think that's going to be highly dependent on the culture of your organization. There's going to be plenty of places where you would probably want to say no, but then there's but ideally you would say yes. I think ideally you have that open communication amongst all the levels, but certainly you need to be highly open to, and you could even set this up in terms of how you organize the tables of, ideally someone's not sitting at a table with someone that they report to, right? That might kind of skew the conversations. That makes sense. Yeah. And then the final thing that I want to mention that is probably kind of more to the point of the original question that was asked, in terms of because I think the next thing suddenly bumps up a lot the level of effort that you have, and that's having an actual onboarding program for leaders. So you need some people who are able to manage this and maintain it and create it. That's what we do for organizations, is we come in and help them create that initial manager training pipeline. And there's really 3 critical elements to that. I think one is, just making sure the program at least identifies, hey, you're a people manager now, you have a new job. And ideally, it's using the definition that we had from the first step to be like, this is what it means to be a manager. Second, you have all of the, basic tools, legal stuff, how to use your HR system, how to approve leave, all those kinds of things. And then the most important thing, in my opinion, is you start to have a series of workshops, and they can be pretty small. I think like in an ideal state, kind of the minimum size is probably 4 90-minute meetings that happen over a month or 2, where you're talking about some of the basic soft skill stuff of, building trust, setting goals, giving feedback, doing those kinds of things, and giving people just some of like the basic skill set that they now need as a people manager. And so, like I said, this is obviously a big step up in commitment. And so you're probably talking about a decent sized organ. You definitely have unless you're working, if you have one HR person's probably not going to be able to put this together. And so that's why we work with a lot of companies like that size, just to augment them in terms of their creation ability and facilitation ability. But if you're going to do it yourself, you're probably talking, you have 4 or 5 people at least in your HR team. Maybe you have a training person, that kind of thing.
But you're telling me we shouldn't promote engineers and then just expect them to know how to lead people from day one without any resources or training?
Yeah, I know. It's weird. It's like you'd expect the abilities, the skill set would just swap over. It'd be so simple. But lo and behold, there are some differences.
All those psychology classes they took in school, right?
Right? Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I really like that. Typically, when you think of onboarding, it's a pretty finite period of time. I like that you extend this out and think very intentionally about like equipping skills and support over an extended period. It's for any new manager that's coming on board. So
yeah, and that feels like the right amount of time that you can learn a lot relatively quickly, but also it's not this like never ending thing, but you do have like the masterminds or to kind of support kind of ongoing development and having a peer group to be able to work through problems with.
Yeah, all these kind of work together, and I think if a company does this, like they are in a really, really solid position to managers not being the limiting factor in their growth and moving forward. And I think that's really the key thing. It's like, how do we prevent managers and manager ability from being the limiting factor? So I know that was kind of a lot. We covered a lot. Any final questions on any of those points? So the point one is right, like first step, just define what it means to be a manager. Step two, create a manager community. Step three, start to create a manager onboarding program for those managers. If you do that, then I think you'll be set up for success. Any final thoughts or questions?
Well, it does seem like each of those three phases align nicely with the development and maturation of a company. And so this should probably be like a circular loop, like you were indicating, where you go back to step one at some certain phase. When would you do that? When would you reach a critical mass where you actually go back and rethink or redefine what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a manager? How big would you need to be?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it has to do. There's probably a lot of number of ways to do it. The first thing that comes to mind for me is complexity of the organization, right? And it's just like, because information flow through the organization is one of the most important things that a manager can either get in the way from or help. And so as you increase the number, so when it starts with all you have are people managers, right? That's one level. Now, all of a sudden, when you get to the stage where you have managers of managers, that's a whole new thing. Maybe you create a formal executive team, which is a C-suite, which now has a new set of responsibilities, or maybe you form a board or whatever it is. I think it's thinking about the complexity of the organizational structure is when you want to return to those loops. And then honestly, anytime in your organization, it's like something isn't working here. Like we've lost our productivity, like nobody knows what's going on. Those are times to think back and like, is there a problem here? That's what I would say.
That's great. Thanks for tying it all together.
Yeah, that was perfect. Yeah. I think it could be a fun future episode to talk about like how do you create a culture where those masterminds are also productive too? Because I think I can see like a whole episode of us just talking about how without the right culture, those might not be very useful, but with the right culture, they can like totally change the trajectory of the organization.
Totally agree. Because it's funny though. I said they're the lowest lift. Yeah, like creating a community is really hard, especially if it's like a sub community. And so, I definitely agree. It could be a whole conversation.
All right, awesome. For later.
Well, we'll cover that later. This was awesome. Hopefully everybody found it helpful, got a little tidbits. Happy to answer more questions if you reach out to me. And thank you so much for all the questions from you all. Hopefully I was able to summarize it all good enough so that you had an initial understanding. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. We'll see you on the next episode.